Narrative games are super hot, gaining millions of dollars on Kickstarter, and I fear generating a belief that if an Ameritrash adventure game doesn't have a novel-sized gamebook, it's going to be a shallow experience. This is J. Allen Riker with Top 5 Solo Games, and today we're going to explore the place of narrative within board games. So I look at Steamforged Games' Horizon Zero Dawn, which went from a game I avoided because of the poor solo experience due to it being a semi-co-op game in Steamforged Games, typically rough draft, expensive rough draft development style, to a game that I will avoid in Horizon Forbidden West because they're going full narrative, though they're also going full co-op. People buy these games imagining they're going to feel like they're living in a meticulously crafted world, and then, for many, that experience falls short. Do you blame yourself? Do you blame the game? I want to look at a related medium of video games. I remember when it seemed like the best way to get immersed in an 8-bit game world was to read a book worth of text. Later, I remember when 3D games started including massive cutscenes to increase immersion. I'm looking at you, Metal Gear Solid. And within a few years, playing a game could end up feeling more like watching a movie with some QuickTime events than an actual video game. Eventually, video game makers figured out the strengths of the medium. Yes, you can still find visual novels. You can still spend 100 hours reading the stories of giant JRPGs, but it's not considered to be superior anymore to video games that have a less directly narrative style taken from other mediums of literature and film. You still find plenty of cutscenes in AAA games, but fewer of them that are half an hour long. Thank goodness. The medium of board games seems to me to still be figuring this balance out. In the past few years, we seem to have swung hard towards including novels in Ameritrash-style games, but I don't think that this will be how things ultimately shake out. Though, like JRPGs still in video games, I do think that there will always be a place for this on the narrative spectrum. I keep mentioning Ameritrash because I feel like it is mostly an issue in that type of game. I think that Euro games seem far more secure in their intellectual legacy. I mean, just from the name Ameritrash games, it sounds like something to be looked down on. It's probably not the best descriptor to be using, although I find it funny as a person who enjoys both types of games, but probably leans a little bit more Ameritrash. But it's almost like Ameritrash games have something to prove, that they are worthy of the time of the sort of intelligent people who are very often the ones who are into board games. I think that it is important to believe when people say that they enjoy things. I believe people when they say that they like narrative-heavy games. I don't think that these multi-million-dollar crowdfunding campaigns are full of people pretending to like narrative games. I do, however, think that there are people who believe that they will get immersed in this sort of game and then end up not being immersed and wondering why. And they might stop playing narrative games entirely, but there are narrative games that find a different balance point on the spectrum between gamification and straight text-heavy narrative. So what else can a board game do to use narrative to help immerse a player? Board games are reliant upon the player's imagination and provide help through imagery, the moving of physical objects, and yes, also through narrative, whether that be in the form of flavor text, a sentence or two of flavor text on a card, or a big ol' honkin' game book. So let me just speak about myself personally and how I relate to narrative in board games. Actually, I can start with discussing more of an overall trait of mine, and that is that I don't switch gears well. I never have. This trait has its benefits. I tend to focus really well, but it also has its drawbacks, like I don't multitask well. I became a computer programmer in my late 30s, and it really solidified for me that I don't shift gears well. I can bash my head against a problem for hours, and a lot of times it feels like a puzzle. Like I feel like I'm in the flow and I'm involved, and it can be kind of fun. Not if it goes on for days on end without making progress, but that's, pretty obvious. So anyway, I do focus well, but if you interrupt me with a question or a meeting, I feel like I have to spend a half hour loading everything back into my mental RAM. On the other end, I am a writer of both fiction and screenplays, which, while I've mentioned it on the channel, I haven't really gotten very deep ever into it. These are some of my books. If you look up Alan Riker on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, you will see a couple for sale. You will find some that are wildly overpriced because they are out of print, and I am working to get some of my older novels back into print. Anyway, that's just evidence that I do take narrative very seriously. Sometimes I might seem a little bit flippant when discussing games, when saying that I will try to skip over the narrative or that I don't like really long chunks of narrative, but that's more of a issue of context switching than anything. If you also, though, find that you have a brain that is sitting down to a board game in order to solve puzzles, but then doesn't like to switch gears out of that, that doesn't mean that you're cursed to play narratively shallow games forever. You might just need a more unified experience instead of switching back and forth, constantly taking an action and then reading a paragraph. And there are a number of ways that a game can approach this. They might focus on an emergent narrative, letting the player develop the story as much as their mind is just naturally inclined to. I really like this approach. I find that it's both creatively satisfying and doesn't get in the way of my puzzling if I'm more deeply engrossed in the mechanics than in the story. It might focus on the story on the opposite end with only small bits of gameplay mixed in. Instead of a full table of components, you have a book or a tablet with a PDF. You've got some dice and a character sheet and a pencil, and you are in a fictional world and not being drawn out of that book to the table constantly. An example of this would be the Fabled Land system. There are a lot of books in this series, and they make a giant connected world that is pretty impressive. For me, I didn't get super into it. One book that I did get really into was The Sword of the Bastard Elf, which is a very irreverent book, very funny, and it's also $5 for an 800-page chock-full book with links in the PDF so that you can zip back and forth depending on what decisions you make. You play it for the laughs, but it also is a genuinely engrossing narrative experience. Then there's a system like Tunnels and Trolls, which I never learned, but I bought a bundle of them, and so I have like 15 books. They're modules, almost like D&D modules, and you can, but more on leaning towards, choose your own adventure. And you learn this one system, and then you dive into a bunch of adventures with different characters. Now, this is not my preferred type of game, but if I'm going to do a bunch of reading, it is my preferred type of game. Another approach would be to focus on small chunks of narrative within a game instead of small chunks of game within a narrative. This seems like I'm splitting hairs, but it makes a big difference for me. I feel like I have agency. I feel like I'm exploring a world in adventure games that have events and encounters on random cards instead of playing a little bit on the board and then looking up something that's been like pre-planned out in a book. Games like this would include Fallout and Witcher Old World. Because you never know what you're going to draw, for me, it really feels like an adventure instead of just playing somebody's story. It still involves some switching of gears, but the small bits of narratives intruding on my game feels okay to me, rather than like chunks of game and chunks of narrative just kind of going back and forth in the same session. That's me though, and everybody's going to have a different balance, and I fully respect that. Another way to approach narrative in a game is that you might bookend it, giving a scenario a setup and then an epilogue. Oathsworn does this masterfully. I've said this so much that I seem like a huge fanboy. I really like the way that they don't intrude upon the action of the scenario with having you have to stop and remember to look something up in the book. But it does have a very good narrative at the beginning, which feels satisfyingly gamified because you are able to move around on a map. And what I really like is that they respect people who don't necessarily want to deal with the narrative that much by letting you read a one-page summary. So I mentioned emergent narrative, and you can get deeply engrossed into games that have emergent narrative. Apocrypha is one where it has the scenario set up, but then it has you playing a bunch of cards that each have bits of flavor text, and these cards are going to be random. The game doesn't know what you're going to have, but it has this thematic unity that allows everything to fit together, sometimes in wild and crazy ways. If you ever want to see a master at work at this, look up the Liching Hour YouTube and his full run through of every one of the 100 adventures in Apocrypha. It's like a masterclass in emergent storytelling. And this really lets me feel like I'm living in the world. I really enjoy this style. So the Fallout and Witcher Old World method of having the story on cards, and a lot of times the cards are sequential as you solve parts of the quests and go deeper into the mysteries. That's a different feel than these that have even less planning than a randomly drawn card, and rather really lean on theme and setting and the actions that you take to help the player form a narrative in their own mind. So I see that as kind of the spectrum of narrative possibilities. There are lots of points that fall in between, kind of probably infinite points. Obviously, I did not describe all of them. This video is already long enough. So now I'm going to ask you, what is your favorite way to experience narrative in a game on a spectrum from none to game book? What have been some of your favorite narrative experiences in board games? Are you personally happy with the trend towards very narrative heavy games? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to have a discussion about it. So thanks for letting me get my thoughts out about this. I wanted to make a video about my favorite emergent narrative campaign games, but I realized that there was so much groundwork to lay that it warranted its own video. Anyway, that's it from me. I hope that you have a great day and keep playing solo.